On a hot Sunday afternoon in August of 2016, a young man shuffled into his apartment, dropped his bag, and locked the door. He had gone to a Blink-182 concert the night before, but he was only now getting home. He went into his bedroom and changed into pajamas. Even though it was still light outside, he felt ready to call it a day. He grabbed a blanket and stretched out on the couch to rest, and just as he closed his eyes, his phone rang. It was his father calling from Boston, Massachusetts, and he said he needed his son's help right now. Seconds later, that young man was up and sprinting out the door of his apartment, still wearing PJs. He jumped into his car and sped down the street. 6 minutes later, he skidded to a stop in front of an office building. He ran inside and waved at the security guard as he ran past the desk, shouting that he'd explain later, and then he ran all the way to the back of the building to a large, heavy safe locked with a keypad. He flipped open a panel and quickly punched in the password. Besides his father, this young man was the only one who knew this code. Inside the safe, he grabbed a small box. Then he shut the safe, locked it, and ran back down the hallway, out of the building, back into his car. Then he drove like a man possessed to the Florida Hospital for Children, weaving around traffic, gunning through yellow lights, and totally ignoring the other drivers who honked at him. When he pulled up to the emergency entrance at this hospital, he glanced at the dashboard clock. He knew he'd gotten there fast, but he just didn't know if he'd been fast enough. If you like today's story, please invite the follow button over your house for a spaghetti dinner, but instead of serving them red sauce, just dump a whole bunch of ketchup on their noodles. On this show, many of the stories we cover are about rare diseases that take people completely by surprise. But sometimes, a condition is so rare, so unexpected, it's hard to believe something like that even exists. But as the people in today's stories find out, they are all too real. On this episode, we have two stories about people who face overwhelming odds against rare, terrifying diseases. Our first story is about a teenage boy whose family vacation to visit his favorite theme parks goes horribly wrong. Then you're going to hear about a young woman whose life is turned totally upside down by a minor kitchen accident. Here's our first story called Look Closely. On August 6, 2016, Sebastian De Leon was slumped in the backseat of a car heading to Orlando, Florida for a short vacation with his parents, Raphael and Brunilda. The drive from their home in Weston, Florida was only about 3 hours. But to 16-year-old Sebastian, the trip felt much longer. He had a lingering headache and his eyes felt itchy and sensitive. He drank some water, rubbed his temples, and focused on the soft rumbling of the car. Sebastian wondered if his headache might be from getting too much sun the day before, since he'd spent the whole day swimming with friends in a lake. But Sebastian worked most of the summer as a camp counselor, so he was outside all the time in the sun, and it never really seemed to bother him, so it didn't make sense to him why yesterday would be any different. Whatever the reason, Sebastian was just totally annoyed at feeling so out of it. He'd been looking forward to this trip to Orlando for weeks. Tomorrow, they had tickets to his favorite amusement park, and tonight they were staying at a nice hotel nearby. It seemed like the perfect dose of late summer fun before school started next month, but Sebastian was worried that he might not feel well enough to even enjoy it. Sebastian groaned, made a pillow out of his duffel bag, and tried to rest. Maybe by the time they got there, the worst of this would be over. But a couple hours later, Sebastian's head was still pounding as his father parked in front of their hotel. Sebastian's parents unloaded the car, and then they all headed up to their room. Sebastian's parents, Raphael and Brunilda, unpacked and got dressed for dinner, but Sebastian felt too dizzy to even think about food. So he crawled into bed and told his parents to go eat without him. He wasn't hungry. Sebastian curled up in the bed, put his blanket over his head, and hoped a good night's sleep would set him straight. But the next morning, Sebastian's head hurt even worse. And now his eyes were starting to ache as well. Even the soft glow of sunlight through the hotel window felt blinding. Sebastian asked his mom to please shut the blinds, but she told him they were closed. Plus, it was cloudy outside. Brunilda sat next to him on the bed and put her hand on his forehead to check if he was feverish. Sebastian winced in pain when she touched him. His skin felt prickly and hypersensitive. Even the bedsheet against his body was very uncomfortable. Sebastian tried to sit up and get out of bed, but the covers suddenly felt too heavy for him to even move. Sebastian felt confused and overwhelmed. He'd never felt so weak and uncomfortable before. It even felt hard to form clear thoughts. He heard his mom making a phone call, then his dad came in and sat beside him. Raphael told Sebastian they were going to take him to a nearby hospital. They had decided that his condition seemed too serious to wait until they got home to deal with. Sebastian's dad helped him get out of bed and get dressed. When his parents opened the hotel room door, Sebastian moaned in pain from the light and turned away. Even with his eyes closed, the light felt almost unbearable. His dad pulled a pair of sunglasses from his shirt pocket and put them on Sebastian's eyes. Then he helped him walk unsteadily down the hallway towards the parking lot. The family reached their car, and Sebastian crawled into the back seat. He heard his parents whispering to each other as they drove away from the hotel. Then Sebastian slipped into a haze. That afternoon, a lab coordinator at the Florida Hospital for Children, named Sheila Black, was drinking coffee between tasks when she heard a knock at her door. It was an assistant nurse with a sample of spinal fluid and Sebastian's patient file. Doctors suspected the young man had meningitis, which is an inflammation of the spinal cord caused by a bacterial or viral infection. One of its most revealing symptoms is sensitivity to light. To test for this disease, Sheila needed to examine the sample of Sebastian's spinal fluid. Sheila thanked the nurse, took the sample to a microscope, and squeezed a dropper of the fluid onto a slide. Then she slid the slide beneath the lens and adjusted the focus. The first thing she saw was that Sebastian's spinal fluid was clear, not cloudy. Spinal fluid is usually clear, but it turns cloudy when it's infected by meningitis. Sheila made a note on the spinal fluid container that Sebastian tested negative for meningitis, but decided to keep studying his sample under the microscope a little bit longer. Overall, the sample looked the way it was supposed to. It was clear, colorless, and scattered with little white blood cells. And so Sheila really had no idea what could be making Sebastian so sick. She scanned through Sebastian's files looking for clues. She noted his age, but then read further to where it mentioned Sebastian had gone swimming in a lake the day before his symptoms started. Going swimming in a lake was not unusual for a Florida teenager, but Sheila had recently attended a seminar about a rare type of microorganism that lives in warm freshwater lakes. When that microorganism enters the human body, it could cause an infection that seems like meningitis, but it's actually much worse. An 11-year-old boy died from this microorganism infection at her hospital only 2 years before, and so Sheila had never forgotten how heartbreaking it felt to be so powerless as that young child slipped away. Sheila hoped her hunch was wrong, but there was only one way to find out. Sheila took another sip of coffee and then leaned in and peered into the microscope again. She stared at Sebastian's spinal fluid sample for a long time, looking for one telltale sign. She couldn't allow a repeat of what happened last time. Then, suddenly, Sheila saw a flicker of movement in the sample. She blinked and looked closer. It happened again. A tiny bulge on one of the white blood cells wiggled. Maybe these were not actually white blood cells. They were something else. Something alive. Maybe they were the very organism she was afraid that Sebastian could have been infected by. Sheila called Sebastian's doctor and told him what she'd just found. If this was what she thought it was, unfortunately, Sebastian was facing a death sentence. Sebastian's doctor, Humberto Liriano, slowly lowered the phone from his ear to his side and leaned his head against the wall. He felt crushed by Sheila's news. As a pediatrician who had treated some of the sickest kids, Dr. Liriano always tried to stay optimistic, even in the darkest times. But sometimes it was hard not to feel totally defeated. If Sheila's finding was accurate, Sebastian did not have much of a chance. Dr. Liriano had treated this same infection 4 other times, and in all 4 cases, none of the patients survived. Still, he felt a deep sense of duty to never give up. No matter how unlikely Sebastian's chance of survival was, Dr. Liriano resolved to fight with everything he had. He made some calls to get a team in place, and then he had Sebastian moved to a room in the critical care unit, and then he went to study Sheila's lab results more closely. And right away, Dr. Liriano could tell from looking at Sebastian's spinal fluid that Sheila's fears were right. This was the worst-case scenario. But there was one ray of hope. Dr. Liriano had heard of a new medication designed to combat Sebastian's condition with this microorganism. It was named Impavido, Spanish for undaunted. But there was a catch. The drug was still undergoing safety review. The makers of Impavido were still negotiating with the Food and Drug Administration for approval to get wider distribution. So very few hospitals were able to stock it, including the Florida Hospital for Children. Dr. Liriano called the hospital's pharmacy. He told them he had a patient who urgently needed Impavido and to call everywhere until they found some. The pharmacist said they would and hung up. Dr. Liriano paced in his office, trying to think of how else he might be able to save Sebastian in case he couldn't get this medication in time. He knew of other patients who had died waiting for it to arrive. Just then, Dr. Liriano's phone rang. It was the hospital's pharmacy. They'd gotten in touch with the Centers for Disease Control, who had already tracked down the CEO of Impavido's manufacturer, which was based right in Orlando. And they apparently said that they had Impavido available and would be happy to supply the hospital with as much as they needed. Dr. Liriano felt a rush of joy at this news until the pharmacist finished their sentence. There was one problem. Impavido was stored in a safe at the CEO's office, and the CEO was out of town. Dr. Liriano groaned in frustration. He asked how long it would be until the CEO could make it back to the office. If the medicine didn't make it to the hospital soon, it would be too late to save Sebastian. The pharmacist said the CEO was away in Boston, Massachusetts through the weekend. There was basically no way he could make it back in time. But there was one other person who had access to the safe, the CEO's son, Michael. Not only that, but Michael was already on his way to get the Impavido for Sebastian. He would then personally rush it to the Florida Hospital for Children. Dr. Liriano was ecstatic to hear this, but none of it would matter if it took too long to deliver the drug, and so he asked where this office was to gauge how long Sebastian would have to wait. And the pharmacist's answer that the company's offices were only about 10 miles from the hospital nearly brought tears of joy to the doctor's eyes. After he hung up with the pharmacist, Dr. Liriano ran to the ER. When he got there, he assigned a nurse to wait by the entrance for the CEO's son, Michael, and the second he got there, this nurse was supposed to take the drug from him and rush it up to the critical care unit where Sebastian was. But there was still one other task that Dr. Liriano had to complete before they could institute this drug, and that was telling Sebastian's parents what was going on with Sebastian. Dr. Liriano steadied himself and then went down the hall to Sebastian's room. He peeked in at the doorway and saw Sebastian lying in bed, barely conscious. His parents, Brunilda and Raphael, sat on opposite sides of the bed, looking totally exhausted and terrified. Dr. Liriano stepped inside and then asked Sebastian's parents to please follow him out into the hall. Dr. Liriano could see in the parents' faces how much they were dreading whatever he was about to tell them. Once they were out in the hall, Dr. Liriano explained Sebastian's situation as clearly as he could. He said their son had caught an infection caused by a microorganism while he was swimming, and now this infection had spread deep into his body and his life was in danger. When he said this, the parents' faces went white. They stared at Dr. Liriano blankly. He told them the good news was that a new medication was on the way to the hospital this very second. The bad news was that Dr. Liriano had never been able to use this medication before, so he didn't know for sure if it would even work. Still, it was the best and potentially only chance they had against an infection with a very low survival rate. Only 3% of people who get this infection survive. Dr. Liriano gave the parents a few minutes to absorb this terrible news. Then he explained that in order to use this new medicine, they would have to put Sebastian into a medically induced coma, taking him to the brink of death in order to save his life. So if they wanted to say anything to Sebastian, now was the time. There might not be a later. Brunilda and Raphael nodded and went back into their son's room. They stood on either side of his bed and held his hands. His mother, Brunilda, cried as she told him what a perfect boy he was and that he was going to be just fine, medicine was on the way that would help him, and God was looking out for him. Sebastian's father, Raphael, made the sign of the cross and squeezed his son's hand. Then he leaned close to his face and told his son how strong he was, how he would beat this, and how they would all live a long, happy life together. Dr. Liriano was very moved by the parents and what they were saying to their son, but at some point he stepped in and asked Brunilda and Raphael to please leave the room, and then he had his nurses prep Sebastian for the medically induced coma, which required them to drastically lower Sebastian's body temperature. The team jumped into action, prepping IVs and hooking Sebastian up to various monitors. Dr. Liriano made sure everything looked good and headed out to the reception desk to wait for the impavido. The whole floor was tense with anticipation. Then the elevator at the end of the hall dinged. Dr. Liriano heard rapid footsteps, and suddenly a nurse sprinted around the corner holding a package. It was the impavido that Michael had brought. Dr. Liriano looked at his watch. He had called the pharmacy less than half an hour ago. Sebastian still had a chance. He ran back to Sebastian's room and quickly opened the container holding the impavido pills. Once Sebastian had taken them, an anesthesiologist sedated him. Within moments, Sebastian was asleep. A nurse gave him an IV drip of cold saltwater solution, while another wrapped him in frozen blankets. Dr. Liriano paced while keeping his eyes glued to Sebastian's monitor. This process would give the medication more time to work, but it was always very dangerous to cool a body so rapidly. Sometimes organs reacted very unpredictably. Within the hour, Sebastian's body temperature was down to 91 degrees Fahrenheit, and Sebastian was officially comatose. Once Sebastian's breathing began to slow, Dr. Liriano gently fed a tube down his throat to help his body maintain a steady flow of oxygen. So far, the procedure had gone exactly as planned. All they could do now was wait and hope. The next morning, Dr. Liriano had some more of Sebastian's spinal fluid drawn to assess how the impavido was doing. He took the fluid down to the lab and studied it under a microscope, and when he looked, he let out a sigh of relief. There were already far fewer tiny wriggling creatures in the sample. The infection had significantly reduced. By the following morning, Dr. Liriano was beginning to believe that Sebastian was actually going to make it. He found Sebastian's parents half asleep on a bench in the waiting room. They jolted awake when he spoke to them. Dr. Liriano told them he didn't want to celebrate too early, but so far, all signs were very positive. When the parents heard this, they cheered and hugged the doctor tightly. But Dr. Liriano made it clear that Sebastian was not out of the woods yet. They still would have to bring him out of the medically induced coma. Dr. Liriano's team began steadily warming Sebastian's body. Minute by minute, his temperature rose until finally he was back at the normal 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit. Dr. Liriano then removed Sebastian's breathing tube and then hovered at his bedside, waiting. Then it happened. Sebastian took a big gulp of air on his own, and his heartbeat remained steady. Sebastian was out of his coma. A little while later, Sebastian's eyes blinked open. He gazed around the room like he'd just woken up from a deep sleep. Dr. Liriano immediately sent a nurse to go get his parents. Brunilda and Raphael rushed inside and threw themselves on their son. Everyone in the room clapped, cheered, and hugged. Dr. Liriano was ecstatic, but also stunned. This wasn't just a miracle, it made history. What Sheila Black found in Sebastian's spinal fluid should have killed him. It's a rare organism called Naegleria fowleri that lives in warm, stagnant waters, exactly like the lake where Sebastian had been swimming. When infected water goes up a swimmer's nose, the microorganism then travels through the body to the brain. Once there, it attacks tissue, basically eating the victim's brain. This causes swelling that eventually shuts the brain down and the victim dies. That's why this organism is commonly known as the brain-eating amoeba. But what confirmed Sheila's hunch that this was a brain-eating amoeba was the organism's particular way of moving. It uses microscopic appendages to row itself like oars on a boat. That's why the microorganisms looked like they were wiggling under the microscope. In 57 years of documented brain-eating amoeba infections, Sebastian had become just the 4th person in the United States to survive after being attacked by them. Dr. Liriano told Sebastian's parents that their son had been both horribly unlucky, but also at the same time extremely lucky. Because if the medicine that ultimately saved his life had been stored basically anywhere else, he probably would not have gotten it in time. Of all the places in the world the medicine manufacturer's headquarters could be, they were also in Orlando, just a few miles from the hospital where Sebastian was. All told, it took less than 20 minutes for the CEO's son to rush and get the medicine and deliver it to the hospital. A few hours after coming out of his medically induced coma, Sebastian was able to speak again. It took 2 years for him to regain all his motor skills, but eventually he made a full recovery.